Hello, everyone. It's me, your friendly classmate, Jeremiah Mikesuk, and this is my presentation on my understanding of the gospel. The title of my presentation is The Gospel According to Galatians chapter 2, verses 15 to 21, and here I go. Within and outside of the church, the term gospel has become ubiquitous. It can refer to anything from a genre of music to a personal creed. However, if gospel is defined through the lens of Paul's remarks in Galatians 2, verses 15 to 21, it takes on a decidedly existential connotation. Contrary to modern understandings of the term, I will argue that there are two distinct dimensions to Paul's conception of it. First, the gospel is not simply an idea that one possesses intellectually. Rather, if one has incorporated the gospel into their being, that person is socially and spiritually transformed. Second, the thorough nature of the transformation that one undergoes through the gospel carries with it distinct applications for modern ministry. Paul developed his transformative depiction of the gospel through the pairing of antithetical terms. In verse 15, for example, the antithetical terms are Jews and Gentiles. There are differing views on how to translate the axial term in this verse, physis. Douglas Moo translates physis as birth. James Dunn alternately renders it as nature. I side with Moo's translation of physis as it more directly highlights the issue that Paul raises here, whether salvation is a birthright. However, Paul does not begin to rectify that issue until the next verse. In verse 16, Paul introduces another pair of antithetical terms that are vital to his depiction of the gospel: works of the law versus faith in Christ. That said, the central term in this verse, and for that matter, the rest of the passage, is justified or dikaio. According to Moo, dikaio and the closely related term dikaiosune, sorry if I botched that, or righteousness, appear 5 times in this passage and 12 times throughout Galatians. Justification, the process through which one comes closer to God, is Paul's main concern in this letter. As a Jewish convert, it is clear to Paul that one cannot be justified through works of the law. In fact, in verse 18, he likens the law to a structure that has been destroyed. Paul stresses this point, adding that he would be a criminal if he were to try to rebuild that which has been destroyed through faith in Christ. Paul's oppositional comments on destruction and rebuilding bear additional parsing as they are critical, to his understanding of the gospel. As Moo points out, Paul's conflation of destruction, rebuilding, and criminality in relation to the law constitute a total reconfiguration of what it means to be justified. Through this conflation, Paul systematically severs the idea of a social component to justification. In other words, one neither needs to be Jewish nor to perform works of the law to be saved. Paul shifts his depiction of justification into an existential domain later in the passage. Beginning in verse 19, Paul uses death and life as his key antithetical terms. He states that he has died to the law, but he celebrates this passing. In that same verse, he adds that dying to the law is the very thing that gives him a chance to live with God. Then, in verse 20, Paul moves his comments on life and death away from the law, stating that he has been crucified with Christ, who now lives in him. There is a debate as to why Paul employed this language of life and death. Dunn leans toward the idea that it is merely an example of hyperbolic rhetoric which Paul used to dramatize his personal conversion to faith in Christ. Beverly Gaventa, on the other hand, views Paul's word choice as a demonstration that the gospel is a singular force that gives life to the believer and informs every aspect of that new life. I side with Gaventa in this debate. For one thing, Paul's use of we in the opening verses of this passage undercuts the idea of him trying to create a personal hyperbolic memoir. Furthermore, the broader context of Galatians puts Paul's comments more into the realm of public discourse. Through this passage, then, I argue that the gospel has a twofold effect on the believer. First, it wipes away demographic boundaries and the conjoined notion that salvation is expressly connected to works of the law. Second, the gospel is an expression of God's love that infuses and informs the life of a believer. I also contend that these effects have implications for modern ministry. Because salvation is not a birthright, it is all the more important for believers to respond to the Great Commission. In particular, we need to increase our efforts to reach out to those who are poor and marginalized. Second, for those of us who are called to shepherd God's flock, it is vital that we instruct congregants on how to infuse the gospel into every facet of their lives. Unless we do that, we are not truly sharing the gospel. Thank you for your time, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.